But it was a lot of work. I heard already that they were having works. Which
by works, you mean fixed fights?
Fixed fights. I was in Japan, and before I went, I got that speech from Chris Doman. He said they're probably going to ask you, to lose or to win a fight. I said, Chris, I don't want to do that.
So how can some fights be fixed in a sport that prides itself on being as real as it gets? No, not Chipotle, the UFC.
I know that there's been fake fights in MMA. I know that. It's just entertainment. Pride was all about entertainment. But I've seen them hit each other for real, but it's a fake fight. I've seen it. And fighters, like we're a different breed. Like people don't understand this. Say me and you fight, and you say, listen, Rampage, I'm gonna give you 10 million to take a dive. I gotta really hit you. I get hit all the time. Okay. And then you know that you're gonna hit me. I know that you're gonna hit me, but you know you're gonna knock me the fuck out. Boxers do that shit all the time.
Well, where there's money involved, there are often people that will try to convince the fighters to do what's best for money, and therefore what's best for both of them. That is how pro wrestling was born, after all. I recently met up in Miami with Bas Rutten at Karate Combat.
That's what she said. I go,
Shout out to KC President Asim for having us at his mansion party. Well, we talked about all sorts of things. A lot of them that, being 100% honest, I can't talk about in the public. But I brought up this one topic. It's called pancrase. And it was very noticeable that him and all the fighters involved in pancrase were very hesitant on talking about it. Now, Bas was super gracious about it, and we talked for hours. But it made me wonder, what happened backstage back in the day in Japan? Look, I know that fixing fights still happens today, but to what extent does it happen still? And how does that compare to what happened back then? Is it still that bad? Well, let's find out. You won't find many who were involved that are willing to talk about this subject today, and in that particular aspect of the era back then either. Hell, even Mark Coleman has never officially admitted throwing that fight against Sakata at Pride 5. And even though it was one of the most well-known fixes of the sport, allegedly, you still can't get the guy to admit that it was fake.
It was a pretty weird finish, wasn't it?
Not to mention that the language barrier makes this topic extremely difficult, because Bas and Ken Shamrock and Mark Coleman were one of the only English-speaking people out there. Guy Mesker has claimed that there's only been 4 or 5 fake fights in pancrase, and that is not 4 or 5 of his, that's 4 or 5 in total. Not a huge number for a promotion that looked like that at all times. However, on the other side, you get Gary Goodbridge, who went on record of saying,
about 50% of their matches were fixed, probably 3. About 25% of the matches were rigged, 4, maybe 10%, and it just went down from there.
Former UFC matchmaker Joe Silva was incredibly skeptical about the fights. And to Chael Sonnen, the whole entire scene was about as real as Pikachu. And that's one of the issues when researching this topic. There is no set list of fixed fights in Pride. Across the board, it seems like there were some real fights happening. Also across the board, you can see that there are some fixed fights happening. But are there still fixed fights happening? We'll get into that later. However, at this moment, what's important is, nowadays, these fights are still in the record and there's no asterisk on Tapology or Sherdog. The fights are listed like they were real fights. Dan Severn's clearly fake fight with Mitsuhiro Matsunaga counts anywhere you look as his 13th career win, and nobody has gone back and taken him away. A bout that took place the same year that he won the UFC Super Fight Championship against Ken Shamrock, who was also, by the way, involved in pancrase and was one of their champions. All right, I had a hesitant Bas Rutten on the topic that wouldn't talk too much about it, so I needed somebody else, somebody who has researched MMA, but also is not shy of the pro wrestling aspect of things. Because if you talk to most MMA people, they think wrestling is a disgrace and won't even touch it. So I needed somebody from the pro wrestling aspect, because at the time in Japan, they were very much blended together. So I found Dave Meltzer. Not only is Dave the premier pro wrestling expert, he's also extensively covered MMA about as long as anybody. The Wrestling Observer newsletter, his publication, has been circulated since 1982 and generally covered and discussed all the major Japanese and MMA promotions as they were performing. And better yet, every single issue of his newsletter is still published on his website. There is no better place to learn about this old school promotions. And Dave has gone on record to to say from the year 2000 to 2002 were completely legit. And he estimates that about 70% before the year 2000 fixed. This is a promotion that Randy Couture, Dan Henderson, Alistair Overeem, Tonio Nogueira, Renato Sobral, Enzo Gracie. This is where Fedor got his start. And prior to the final few years when those guys showed up, 70% of those fights were fake. Which ones? And like I said, it still begs the question, what happens today? I came up with 3 promotions that require further investigation. Shudo, formed in 1986 by legendary pro wrestler Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama. Shudo wasn't a fight league originally though, it was a martial arts system mixing wrestling and mixed martial arts. However, in '94, they would hold their first Valley Tudo event, which would be the catalyst for the JMMA that we see today. Fight Network Rings, founded by also pro wrestler Akira Maeda in 1991. And as stated by Dave Meltzer, Maeda wanted the promotion to be 100% real fights at the beginning. They brought real talent with real experience in real fighting to just hammer home the fact that this was legit fighting. Rings would very much look like the pro wrestling that Kenta Maeda's fans would previously watch. And then there was of course Pancrase, which was founded by Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki. And take a guess at what they were doing before they created the promotion. In fact, one of them is still doing it. Take a guess. These were the big 3, the ones that are the most vital to the formation of MMA from that era in Japan. Pride FC would of course come years later in 1997. In case you're not familiar with pro wrestling terminology, there are shoots and there are works. A shoot is a real fight and a work is a fake fight. How did the main stars at the time in professional wrestling became the bedrock foundation of this new sport that didn't exist? All these 3 promotions existed before the UFC, so it's not like they were jumping into some kind of fad. And when you trace the wrestling career backwards, you find that all 4 men jumped ship at the same point, or at the same man rather, named Karl Gotch. And he plays a very important role in this story. However, so you know who the person is, we gotta backtrack a little bit. Alright, so as far as I'm concerned, is the reason we got fixed fighting in Japan in the 1990s starts all the way back in Wales of all places, in 1877 with a guy named John Graham Chambers, who created Catch as Catch Can wrestling. And then everybody realized that Catch as Catch Can wrestling is one of the worst names in the history of anything, so people started calling it catch wrestling. And this was a huge hit in both Europe and in the United States, and became a popular professional sport. Even made it to the Olympics. And a lot of the guys that were pros were competing as strongmans at carnivals to make money off their skills. And what they would do is just challenge anybody to have a match with them right then and there. If they were able to outlast the strongman for a certain amount of time, they would win a prize. And as you can imagine, these wrestlers were badasses and f***ed the locals up. Not exactly good business because people would stop showing up, so they started planting fake locals and beat them in front of the crowd every few hours or so, encouraging others to give it a try, only to get hustled out of their money. That's right, the strongmen wrestlers were having fake fights. Well, guess what happened? The wrestlers were like, we could do this in our actual catch wrestling bouts, and we can stay injury free and make a bunch of money and have more exciting matches if we just work together. Around the 1920s, people caught on that catch wrestling was no longer real though, at the professional level, which was a massive bummer because prior to people knowing this, it was a massive sport. The solution was twofold. At the amateur level, get rid of these submissions because they're a little too aggressive. And in order to disassociate with the bad reputation the sports had, give it a new name. Let's call it freestyle wrestling. The arguable best base for all mixed martial arts and the most beloved form of amateur wrestler here in the US and around the world is just catch wrestling with more rules. Now, pro catch was still in the dumps and making no money. It just didn't have any of the money that it once did when it was considered a legitimate competition. Then just 3 guys called the Gold Dust Trio, they decided, hey, let's make catch wrestling a little bit flashier. Let's add some drama, let's create some personas, gimmicks if you will, and really turn it into a show so the crowds get back into it. Yes, that's right. Catch wrestling created both professional wrestling and freestyle wrestling. But you might want to refill that popcorn because I'm not done yet. There was this judoka named Mitsuyo Maeda. He didn't want to compete in and only teach judo. He wanted to test his skills against other martial arts, other forms of combat sports essentially. So he traveled to Europe and the US to look for competition and began to participate in catch wrestling bouts since it was so popular at the time. Well, Maeda, after the US, eventually made a trip down to Brazil. And he applied the mixtures of styles and techniques he had been learning throughout the world. And he taught a guy named Carlos Gracie how to fight. And Carlos in turn taught his younger brother Elio what he learned from Maeda. Catch wrestling also created Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. All right, now that your mind is thoroughly exploded and you got a history lesson, what does all this have to do with fixed fights in Japan? More accurately, who is this Karl Gotch guy that seems to be the commonality between all of these mixtures? Well, our suspect, Karl Gotch, was a badass Greco-Roman wrestler, a badass Greco-Roman Olympian turned legit catch wrestler who, like many of the others, had to transition to the more gimmicky version of catch wrestling. He wasn't one for the over-the-top techniques. He was fine with the fixing of the fights, of course, but he got his wrestling style very much from the old school version of catch wrestling. He was not as attention grabbing as anybody else. So his lack of stardom and him getting into a fight backstage with one of the biggest stars that wrestling had, with Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, and breaking his arm in the process, Karl Gotch would be blacklisted and head to Japan in order to find a job as a pro wrestler. And it turns out he couldn't have broken Buddy Rogers' arm at a better time, because when he flew to Japan, he realized that it was the perfect time for fixed fighting in Japan, as people in Japan were so tired of the over-the-top gimmicky wrestling and they just wanted more real fake wrestling. I know it sounds confusing, but it was what it was happening at the time in Japan. And catch wrestling was just that. Karl Gotch became a wrestling god. That's literally what they called him back there, a wrestling god. And anybody that was anybody wanted to train with Karl and get his catch wrestling style, including one you might have heard of called Antonio Inoki, who had that mixed rules match with Muhammad Ali, and the one that would popularize shoot style wrestling even further when he would create New Japan Pro Wrestling, which is a promotion that still runs to this day. Some of Gotch's other disciples, Satoru Maeda, Akira Mayada, Masakazu Fujinami, Minoru Suzuki, were also trained by Karl Gotch. Yes, the 4 guys that founded the 3 promotions were trained by Karl Gotch. You see, everything goes back to Gotch. Everything goes back to catch wrestling. But how did these 4 guys go from wanting to have pro wrestling fights looking as real as possible, using real techniques, using everything, to actually going real with the fights? Well, what actually happened is that Karl Gotch trained the athletes like real athletes. He trained them like real fighters. He wasn't training them for a fake show. He was training them for the real deal. It just happened that when the card came by and they put the show on, they knew who was gonna win the fights. They taught them these real catch techniques. And just like MMA, these wrestlers would start not only training catch wrestling or freestyle wrestling, whatever you want to call it, they also started learning about other disciplines, just like MMA. And they would have shoot bouts at the gym, sparrings essentially. As a result of the training and the realistic nature of the show, these guys would be treated like legitimate badasses. Well, because they were. And with time, some of these guys would explore with legitimate shoot fights in these other promotions. And the interest of having this fake wrestlers fight kept growing. As well as with many of the wrestlers they had been training, they wanted to try their skills now in a real competition. So then our 4 suspects, Tiger Mask, Maeda, Funaki, and Suzuki, all had this training and all found themselves free of the major wrestling promotions at the same time roughly, allowed them to start this proto MMA sort of gray area promotions. So after learning how and why our suspects founded the promotions, I have to admit I was still a little bit skeptical. After all, if you learning the real techniques made you want to fight for real, why would you fake those fights? That makes absolutely no sense to me. As it turns out, the organization that seemed to be the most pseudo-realistic one was Shudo. You see, Tiger Mask didn't even start with pro bouts. In fact, he started with amateur bouts as early as 1986. And it seems that he wanted to start this new martial art that actually would end up becoming the UFC in a way. As such, it doesn't appear that fight fixes are part of the Shudo story at all. And the promotion wasn't particularly popular at the time either. However, like I said earlier, that would change with Vale-Tudo Japan 94. An event that was trying to be as real and raw as the first 2 UFC tournaments. They wanted Royce Gracie for the fight, however Rickson would be the one that would find himself in Japan, representing the family instead. And after winning the tournament, he became the new hotness in Japan. These very clearly real fights threatened the credibility of fake wrestlers who challenged Rickson to a real fight, with the first ever Pride event taking place and being funded simply to finally see Takada and Gracie settle their rivalry. The popularity of that event would mean that there would be a second Pride show, and the rest is history with Pride. But if Shudo is slightly clean, rings wrestling is the complete opposite. And funny enough, all these people that they brought from overseas that they brought in to make the fights look more realistic, turned out that they made the fights look even faker because they did not know how to act. Well, with Shudo not being as popular prior to the Vale-Tudo cards and rings being clearly fake, Pancrase was kind of the best of both worlds. Really popular, dare I say slightly legit. It has not only the most popularity, but the best reputation to this day, I would argue, in terms of its legitimacy and its growth for mixed martial arts. However, as explained in the book Shooters, it was always intended for Pancrase fights to be real. However, that wasn't the case. In fact, bouts were often extended with work in them to extend the fights and make it more exciting. And Funaki, who's not only one of the founders, but also one of the promotion's top competitors, would take dives in order to build new stars. So there seems to be a gray area between the fights being fixed and being extended, and the fighters actually didn't talk about it with each other. It sounds like an unspoken reality and spoken rule that just kind of happened. When I was talking to Bas Rutten, one of the top stars in the promotion, he mentioned that while he did know that the pro wrestling type stuff was happening, he never fixed a fight or he never did anything pro wrestling related, not even extending fights. And if you watch any of his fights, you can see that he wasn't in the business of play fighting. But there were so many other pro wrestling aspects to the whole Pancrase picture that we're just not knowing who wins the fight. The reason that we're able to have fighters that competed so often is because they designed the rules specifically to mitigate any sort of damage a fighter might get. There were some unwritten rules that fighters followed to mitigate injuries to their opponents, like not striking each other in the face on the ground with open palms, wear protective gear like their famous shin guards. I mean, yeah, it seems like a no-brainer. You don't want injuries, but the reason they wanted safety is because they could compete against each other more often. Now, don't get me wrong, Pancrase definitely had real fights. There's no doubt about it, and it is still a vital part of MMA history. But there seemed to be a lot more pro wrestling there than fans think. And that is truly the biggest takeaway that I have in this video, because nowadays, fixed fighting is perceived so much differently. But should it be perceived that way? Pro wrestling still has a strong hold in MMA, and it carries on today with promotions like Ryzen or maybe even Bellator.
And the only thing bigger than his head is his inflated ego. Proof of that is right here. This guy helped him win many world championships. You might recognize him from being in his corner for all those fights. And all he had to give him in return for thanks was nothing. Flushed him down the toilet like a turd.
Even though I will say it is a lot more present in the Eastern world than it is in the Western world. But you could also attribute that to the fact that Pride FC heavily been involved with the Yakuza. The insanity of fight fixing and holding managers hostage and whatnot. But I consider that a whole different aspect of fixing fights. But yeah, they certainly didn't help the legitimacy cause in the end. A perfect example happened in Rising not too long ago. Floyd Mayweather at an exhibition with Tenshin Nasukawa. The fight was brought to question as soon as the fight ended. But Mayweather's not the only one. Boxing has taken a showman approach lately a lot. Who knows? Jake Paul, who knows? Logan Paul, who knows? Any sort of top star, Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury, all of them have some sort of involvement in professional wrestling. Colby Covington himself has mentioned that fights have been fixed in the UFC.
What did you think of John's performance over Cyril Gane in his last fight?
It was a work. It looks like it was a fix. Maybe John Jones's brothers went over to France and told Cyril that you know, they're going to pay him under the table to take a dive. Because that's honestly what it looked like.
However, we will never truly know, but what we do know is the success that all of this has brought. You can check out either of these two videos to see either how much UFC fighters made or how the UFC became as important as it is right now, with fighting as real as it gets. Whether that involves fake fighting or not, we don't know, but it seems like real fighting was never really fully real. So I'll see you in that video. See you!
Ballin' now, skirt down, all of these diamonds sold. Bottom for me with the yours now. You could drink it, but take it slow. Ballin' for you, falling for